Very excited. So what my talk is going to be on is the UX multiplier effect. For all of you who are mathy, love that for you, but we won't be doing any today, thank goodness. So let's get started. So I'm Amanda, and I have about 10 years of experience in design, innovation, research, and strategy, and a whole bunch of other things. I've been able to play within spaces of film, media, tech, education, all types of industries that have really enabled me to test a lot of this kind of effect, not just from the UX lens, but other areas. But today I'm kind of, for UX value, focusing in on this particular way to multiply impact. So, UX often stops at the product boundary line, right? So, in the sense of we maybe get a little tunnel vision of where we're in those sprints or we're doing those, very fast turnarounds, whether it be usability studies or designing an interface or what have you. And I want to expand that purview as it relates to impact from a UX perspective. So how can we do that in terms of org-wide impact as it relates to beyond the product boundary line? We're going to explore that today. So here are 3 different ways in which we're going to be looking at that multiplier UX framework that I've come up with, as well as ways of, how does this look in practice? Like what does this really mean in terms of, shifting our paradigms? And then, of course, looking at influence leverage points. So the UX multiplier effect. So one of the biggest things that I think we want to be mindful of when we're looking at this and thinking of this new lens or POV is this idea of shifting from outputting artifacts, right, into embedding methodologies. So that means a little bit more macro. Say the micro, we could look at it as anything related to where UX touches in the daily, right? We're grinding, we're doing our deal, we're making a difference, but how do we zoom out, right? How do we think about our company and, our larger base of influence? So looking at some of these things as it relates to mindset, we have traditional kind of versus multiplier mindset. So if you look at the left side, we've got product deliverables, right? Some of the things that we're typically seeing in the design and research kind of product vein or lens, got A/B testing, style guides, journey maps, information architecture, and user flows. But what does it look like when our mindset starts looking at organizational impact in that kind of right column here, where we're seeing partner relationships or cultivating a data culture, cross-team mentoring, as well as ways to democratize our insights or even our roadmap of influence. So this kind of parallel, I think, is really important to maybe do an internal audit where you look at, what am I doing in the daily? And then how do I make that impact in a larger scale? How do I touch across more areas and have that ripple effect? So again, it's not limited to these, but I think these are just some core principles that I would say have been a bit of a guiding light for me in my career thus far, and I've been able to mentor and support others in, is, these 3 kind of core principles in transcending the deliverable, right? We just talked about that a little bit. So shifting from outputting artifacts to those methodologies, seeking that kind of systems leverage. So what I mean is that, where you have the effort that you can have little movement in, you can start to kind of, ripple out and begin to expand in those leverage areas, whether that be evangelizing or what have you. And then, of course, cultivating champions. These are advocates, right? People on your side of the bench or in that dugout with you, for all my sports analogy friends that are really advocating or supporting the work that you're doing, and whether that's team members or stakeholders or people in different divisions and departments, seeing what you do and how you also receive what they do and ignite and kind of empower what they do, and it's just sort of this beautiful reciprocity. So let's dive into some of these core principles. So the first one, I would say, If I had to, pin it down, would be sort of transcending the deliverable, right? So this is moving beyond those prototypes or wireframes, again, whatever lens you're approaching it with, research or design, and moving into trying to, teach or knowledge share in your skill sets as it relates to being a user-centered thinker, leveraging that human-centered modality that we all have as sort of UX professionals, and kind of refining that muscle. It's also that, your work within the product zone becomes more of an organizational capability. So, how do you, again, bridge that in, not just your designs or your research, but how do you think a little bit more macro? And then, success metrics, thinking about shifting from, I shipped these designs or I did this readout as a researcher, but I'm actually looking at metrics around decisions that I'm influencing, whether it be team-wide, whether it be in a certain user flow that you're creating, and then how do you do that on a larger scale when you get into those bigger department-wide divisional meetings. The second core principle is seeking, systems leverage. So this is where we start to get a little bit of an investigative journalist, as I would call it. And this idea of identifying bottlenecks, right? So where are these kind of like areas where, you have UX thinking opportunities to kind of unlock bottlenecks for various teams at once. Again, that might seem overwhelming, but maybe just look at like one area. How does a issue that relates to, UX thinking that is having a bottleneck for others, could that be expanded, right? And this other idea of, looking at root causes, right? We could imagine that, oh, this, that, and the other is because of this. Well, if we're communicating clearly, or if we're having knowledge sharing sessions or developing workshops where we're kind of a little stand up learning about silos or, divisions or what have you outside of ours, it sort of breaks that down and it becomes less of an issue. And then also, focusing on interventions at scale. So this idea of, how do you continue to just move that needle, right? And again, it's a long game. Think of a marathon. Life is funny that way. So I think this idea of like, even though we work oftentimes in sprints, think about it as you're really playing the field in that longer movement as it relates to your leverage impact. And then the third core principle would be cultivating, those advocates. How do you thought lead? This idea of, teaching how to fish rather than only delivering fish. And so I think this idea about like, I'm just handing off wires, or I'm just telling you about my research. Like there's more to it than that, right? Like really standing in that and owning that. And then also looking for those champions, those advocates to spread, UX methodology when you're not in the room. And that comes from rapport building, trust building, whether that be your colleagues or collaborations that you seek out in different departments or divisions, really building that netting, right? And so that you can, see others, but also support yourself as well as you're supporting others. And this idea of building, in that a distributed network of design thinking that operates autonomously, right? So we're zooming out, we're macro, we're thinking a little bit bigger in terms of that network of advocates. So, that's section one, if you will, of the presentation. So I wanted to now think about what does this mean as it relates to shifting that paradigm. Like we saw how it looks if I shift my mindset from traditional outputs to more wider scheme, but what does that paradigm shift look like? This is one of my all-time favorite quotes, and I use it often when I'm in kind of speaking settings like this, or I'm in mentor sessions where I'm helping mentees out. But this idea of how do you work within the constraint? Really thinking about where I am today and how do I like flourish in that? What does that look like when I expand in that place, or I find a way to just get creative in my problem solving, in my approach, in my POV? So a lot of that often can look like, leading without a title. I think it's easy for us to get kind of, tied up and disentangle from this idea of hierarchy or titles or naming. But what's really powerful here is that it's how you approach it in this paradigm shift. So these sort of, moments here of having solution ownership where we own problems beyond our job description. I would encourage you all to seek this out, find ways to kind of like, elbow in there, learn, grow, and expand yourself. But also relationship building. When you lead without a title, you have this ability to invest in connections across functions. And that, again, doesn't require you to have insane seniority or this idea of, I can only do this if I'm this, right? We're gonna banish all that. We're gonna remove all that. So the idea too of knowledge sharing, like how do you become that go-to resource for others, right? How do you lean into that human-centered listening or ways in which that you can influence or impact others? I think that this idea of just sharing the good, right? And learning from others and just really having that be an open framework. And then this idea of taking initiative, right? It's a little tied to solution ownership, but this moment of where we go macro and we see those bottlenecks, right? So we propose improvements or we volunteer for new challenges. Again, everything we put ourselves out there and do is always going to refine it and shape us. And in most cases, we find that discovery, we might be really skilled in an area we didn't even know. And then of course, a favorite, this idea of future thinking. Connecting work daily to those bigger picture organizational goals, but also, dare I say, looking at the market, the industry, the world, what's happening out there, how do I bring that in and make impact where I am? So this idea of like shattering some of these limiting beliefs and sparking momentum can look a little bit like this, and it's not limited to this, but this idea of, well, I don't have authority, what if you were able to focus instead on your expertise and your ability to build relationships? Like that immediately just diffuses that kind of limiting belief. Or people won't listen, just start small, improve value and build credibility incrementally. Or maybe you feel like I'm inexperienced, I'm too junior, or I don't have that leader title, even though I have all this, potential and I want to serve and support people. Just know that you bring a fresh perspective and an energy that not everyone can, there's only one you, right? And, maybe even there's this thing of, well, I don't want to step on, someone's toes, being able to instead shift that to collaboration in the sense of it multiplying your influence and impact. So as we learn, we just build a larger network, right? We support others, they support us, and it's just really fantastic. So this is just like a fun little visual of like what this journey may look like. Let's say, and you may never even experience this, you've got sort of a skeptic as it relates to, well, how can UX really influence an organization? They're just product people, or what have you. But like, this is how this journey could be visualized, right? You get observers like coming into your wireframes. Maybe you're doing team-wide kind of walkthroughs or iterations off of the research. Or maybe you're, as a researcher, you're inviting people into your protocol. You're learning about their skill sets and their abilities. Then they become an observer and even an active participant. They're in your interviews, whether they're an AI engineer or a developer or a learning scientist. They're sitting in, they're seeing live action, that idea of what the user is experiencing. And so they're hooked in, they're getting engaged. And then of course that eventually will evolve into having champions or advocates for you. Again, whether you're a designer or a researcher. So looking at these influence leverage points, what is a leverage point? And I kind of included this idea of a ripple effect. They're essentially these moments within the research and design kind of forte or expertise where you could solve larger or even broader business problems. And then of course, the ripple effect comes throughout your organization. So we're looking at this matrix, right? Probably very familiar to many of you in this idea of high impact, high effort and vice versa. So these are some interesting areas that we could focus in on, but like, what if you were, again, to do this self-audit on your team, or maybe you're a designer, what if you put heads together with your researcher that you work with and find ways to kind of collaborate and audit together. What if we were to do some of these things? Is this a high impact, but it's low effort? We should go for it. Really taking time to think through this idea of, a design system, or maybe it's like facilitating design workshops, or this idea of like leaning into testing protocols, or maybe like a user journey workshop, like really getting playful and creative in the way that you look at these ideas to have leverage points. And I think that that's something where, again, if you just keep your mind's eye open and you learn from others, stay connected, that's going to be a way that you're going to grow as an individual. So in terms of, some signifiers as it relates to kind of these organizational signals, there's kind of these 3 moments that I've identified as it relates to these high leverage opportunities where UX thinking, UX methodologies can create, a lot of impact. So the first one would be friction clusters, right? So again, we're zooming out, we're thinking about how maybe multiple teams are having some bottlenecks or issues around the same processes or tools. How do we reinvent the wheel? How do we reapproach this, right? And then this repeated idea of like workarounds emerging organically. How do we kind of like find a new way to go about it? And then this idea of like maybe people just say, well, that's just how we do it. I would take that as like an opportunity rather than this is in concrete cement. Find ways to go, okay, well, if that's how we do it, what if we tried a different way? Or how would you want to do it differently? Then that becomes an open dialogue. And then you start building rapport and connection. And this idea of, like these bottlenecks, just looking for where these points are in your organization. And then, this wonderful moment of where we can start to bridge, right? So, we're breaking down communication, or we're doing so by like having more consistent touch points. We're learning about the other and they're hearing about what we do, less of these kind of throw it over the wall moments, and we're going to be more collaborative. And, this idea of, duplicate work that might be happening in silos, how do you kind of come together and create just a really symbiotic and connective tissue between those outputs? And then, looking for those missing feedback loops as it relates to functions or workflows that are the same. So we're just looking for those bridging moments. And then, of course, we take all that and find these junctures where we can amplify it, right? So processes that touch every employee, whether it's onboarding tools or interfaces or whiteboards or whatever it could be, decisions that would cascade across multiple teams. So how could UX thinking impact people in brand, creative, people in market science, all these other divisions that might exist in your org or others? Finding cultural moments, right? Like maybe you're entering a reorg, or there's new leadership, or maybe there's a strategic, pivot as it relates to the work you're doing. Finding ways to hear others and sort of like grow together, be that champion for them, and just really take that as an opportunity. And then, of course, training or knowledge sharing, finding ways to, meeting of the minds together and really sharing out ways to have that amplification. And then, of course, infrastructure changes that affect everyone. These are moments where you can just infuse UX thinking, design thinking into the work you do. So ultimately, I want to leave you with the thought of what can you multiply? What will you multiply moving forward, whether it be in your own kind of company, or maybe you're wanting to start your own company. How do you make that organizational impact, whether you're a designer or a researcher? Thank you all so much. And I'd love to open up the floor if anyone has any questions. More than happy to dialogue on what I shared today. Thanks for the hearts. I appreciate it.
So yeah, we'll give folk a little time. Sometimes it takes a bit for questions to come in. We'll give a minute or two.
Awesome. Also, happy Thursday, everyone. I'm glad we're rounding out the week. You've almost made it. And then you can have the weekend to think about how you can multiply. So,
But we have a question
okay.
from Lucia. I'll show on screen.
So, so I'm assuming you're saying the shift of being like a multiplier, right? This idea of that kind of movement. If that's the case, I would say, the resistance I think is really navigatable. I think there's a lot of groundwork that happens before we get to it. The times that I've experienced it, I think, you just, oh yeah, you're welcome. You just, find ways to, again, sow the seed, if you will. So this notion of, learning about the other. So say I'm on a product team, right? And say I, move across different vertical lines or we start new products. I'm going to do a little meet and greet. Maybe you start to hold sessions with people in different departments, divisions, find out who they are, why they're here, why they believe in what we're doing. And if they don't, find out why that is also. And then, discover how you can learn and grow together, and maybe we could workshop, maybe we could meet together with the minds. I think the resistance can definitely be mitigated by doing that early work. So, in terms of that, I think just lean, if there is resistance, lean on those that you're building those alliances and those influence points with. And, it will just come in time. It will organically kind of flourish as you, build the rapport and trust with those individuals.
Awesome. Looks like we have some others as well.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yes. Susie has a question.
Oh, hey. Okay. As someone starting in a new company, first time UX designer, get it. That's awesome. Any advice on introducing to? I got you. So this is like an area that I've played in a lot. So I oftentimes think that one of the best ways to do that is getting to know them. So like my strategy would be, especially as it relates to developers and PMs, everyone, we're all bringing expertise and skills to the table, right? And ultimately, think about it as like psychology. People value being heard and understood. So what if you started holding, especially since you're new, this is easy, just play like the new employee card, right? And hold some of those meet and greets, schedule like a one-to-one, 15-minute, 30-minute, I think is better because then no one's rushed. And, with your developer and just go, tell me about the lay of the land. What are you doing? What are you inspired by? What are we creating? What are some challenges you're facing? Same with your PM. You bring in a lot to the table as a UX designer. How do I facilitate? And then also, this is an opportunity for you to show what you bring to the table, right? So that knowledge sharing, that connection and rapport building, that's an opportunity where you can discover about them, but then they also start to they're clocking with what you're bringing to the table. And so I would say open up your process. So as a UX designer, if I'm holding, wireframe walkthroughs or, design flow, invite them in to that process, get them in your Figma board, like do whatever you can. And like, just validate that influence and that opportunity where they can have some feedback in there. Because when people feel seen and heard, it's multiplying, right? So they're gonna dish that back to you. And same with PMs. And did we
Awesome.
have another one, Dale?
I
Oh,
think we
sorry.
had, and no, though. I think we actually had one from Narish himself.
Okay, hi. Do you think UX should start looking into, here's the thing, the market is cray cray, right? We all know that. I think it's silly to negate the fact that the job market, the world, the industry is a little turbulent at time of now. And so I think bottom line, like again, right, leading without a title, I can be a UX designer, I can be a researcher, but I can also be really strategic. So again, I think like a PM, right? Or a PO. And so I think that's also a way where you can kind of infuse that. So take on, what those things are. And again, you're putting tools in your tool belt. So you have this opportunity to like get in there and help develop that roadmap. Or, how do I facilitate and support you? Maybe lean into your PM at your company and be like, I'd love to like learn more about this role, or how do I infuse this into what it is that I'm doing in, user facing side of things, or, product interface side of things. So yeah, I mean, I think innately, the greatest PMs that I've worked with are ones that are extremely human centered, that have that UX kind of brain, really advocates for users. We all know that as UX professionals, that's like our bread and butter. So I think it's really a matter of plug and play. If you want to go into PM sort of genres, for all you out there, I think definitely don't feel like you're an imposter.
Excellent. So I think that's everything. So thank you, Amanda. It was a pleasure for you also to round off the conference as well. It's a huge privilege to have you as our last speakers. And thanks to everyone as well for tuning in, and also for all your questions to Amanda.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And you can scan that QR code, take you right to my LinkedIn. Happy to keep the convo going. And just so thrilled to be here. And thank you both to the conference moderators for putting this on. It's just such an honor to be here. I'll see you guys.